The snow started falling before dawn. By the time they built the gallows in the center of Kearney's main square, there was already an inch of white covering the frozen ground, and the sky had turned the color of old pewter, flat and heavy and indifferent to what was about to happen beneath it. Clara Weston stood on the platform and looked out at the crowd. She was 22 years old. She had brown eyes that had seen too much in the last 3 weeks, and dark hair that the wind kept pulling loose from the pins at the back of her neck, and hands that would not stop shaking no matter how hard she pressed them against her thighs. She was wearing the same blue wool dress she had arrived in. The hem was still crusted with mud from the night she ran. She had stopped crying 2 days ago. She had spent the first day in that cell crying until there was nothing left. She had spent the second day sitting with her back against the cold stone wall, listening to the sound of hammers, thinking about Philadelphia, about the boarding house on Chestnut Street where she had grown up after her parents died, about the thin mattress and the cracked window, and the letter she had answered in the back pages of the Philadelphia Inquirer, a small advertisement barely 4 lines long, asking for a woman of good character who was willing to start a new life in the Nebraska Territory. She had been 21 when she answered that letter. She had been so certain it was the right thing to do. The marshal, a lean, quiet man named Gideon Voss with deep-set eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the courthouse steps, stood to her left with his hand resting near the lever. He was not looking at her. He had not looked at her once since they brought her up the stairs to the platform. Voss was Silas Dutton's cousin by his mother's side, and he had worn the law's badge in Kearney for 6 years by Silas Dutton's design, and Clara understood in the way you understand things when your mind is working very clearly, because there is nothing left to be afraid of, that his refusal to look at her was not indifference. It was something harder to name than that. He did not believe she had stolen those horses. He was going to hang her anyway. To his left stood a cluster of deputies. Below the platform, the crowd pressed forward in the snow. Clara looked at their faces, ranchers and shopkeepers, and women in dark wool coats who watched with the careful blankness of people who had already decided the outcome before any of this began. There were children at the edges of the crowd, some of them watching with open curiosity, the way children watch anything they don't yet have the language to understand. She wanted to tell them to go home. She thought about the rope. She could feel it against the back of her neck, rough and thick, and smelling of hemp, and something metallic she did not want to name. They had tightened it twice. The marshal had done it himself, his hands precise and impersonal, and when he had reached up to test the knot for the final time, Clara had looked directly at the side of his face and seen something there, a tightening around the eye, a muscle working in his jaw that told her what she needed to know about his certainty or the absence of it. 3 weeks earlier, Clara Weston had stepped off a westbound train at the Kearney Depot carrying a single leather trunk, a small reticule with $12 inside, and a folded letter that she had read so many times the creases were soft as cloth. The letter was from a man named Silas Dutton. He had written clearly and without much warmth, but there had been something in the plainness of his language that Clara had taken at the time as honesty. He was 48. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He needed a wife to manage his household, and he was prepared to offer a good home and financial security to the right woman. The contract, signed before a Philadelphia notary and witnessed by the employment agency that had arranged the correspondence, laid out the terms precisely. Clara had not expected love. She had expected something better than what she had. A room that was hers. A table that was set the same way every morning. A life that did not depend entirely on the goodwill of a landlady who raised the rent every winter. She had not expected standing on the depot platform with the Nebraska wind hitting her for the first time and taking her breath clean away to feel afraid. But she had. Silas Dutton met her at the depot himself. He was a large man, wide through the chest and shoulders, with a heavy jaw and small gray eyes that assessed her the way a man assesses livestock at a fair. He did not offer to shake her hand. He looked her over, nodded once as though confirming something he had already decided, and said that the wagon was waiting. She told herself the feeling in her stomach was only nerves. She told herself that as they drove out of town. She told herself that during the silent dinner at the long table in his ranch house, where she sat at the far end and ate cold beef and bread while Dutton talked at her about cattle prices and spring grass and the particular incompetence of his neighboring ranchers. She told herself that when he showed her to her room, a small one at the end of the hall with a latch on the inside, that she tested 3 times before she took off her boots and said only that the wedding would be in 2 weeks and she should be ready. She did not sleep. At 3 in the morning, she heard voices below. Loud ones, a man arguing high and desperate words tumbling over each other the way words do when a man is begging. She rose from the bed, crossed to the window in her stocking feet, and looked down into the ranch yard. There were 4 men below. 3 of them she did not know. The fourth was Silas Dutton, standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his back to the house, and he was speaking in a voice so quiet she could not make out the words. The man who was arguing was a small, raw-boned farmer in his 40s. She could see his face clearly in the lantern light. She would never forget that face. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it around and around, and the fear on him was so total it had become something else, something that looked almost like grief. He had a daughter, Clara would later learn, 14 years old. A man with a daughter is a man with something to lose, and he knew standing there in the mud of Silas Dutton's ranch yard that he was losing everything. Silas stopped talking. He made a small motion with his right hand, a motion so casual it might have meant nothing at all, and one of the other men raised a rifle and fired once. The farmer went down in the mud of the ranch yard and did not move again. Clara pressed her hand over her mouth so hard she tasted blood. She stood at the window for a long moment that stretched out and out until it had no edges, watching the 3 men drag the body toward the far side of the barn. Watching Silas Dutton walk back toward the house, his pace unhurried, his coat brushing the tops of his boots. She heard the front door open, his footsteps on the staircase. She moved. She did not pack. She took her reticule with the $12 her coat from the hook behind the door, her boots and the folded contract from inside her trunk. She did not know why she took the contract, only that her hands grabbed it before her mind had time to reason it through. She went out the window, down the porch roof, across the ranch yard, and ran. She ran north. She ran until Dutton's ranch lights were gone behind her and the cold had taken feeling from her hands and feet, and then she kept running because the alternative was worse than the cold. She ran straight into Kearney. She had nowhere else to go. They found her at first light, standing at the edge of town with mud on her dress and a man's horse trailing behind her. She had taken it from a fence post 2 miles out, a decision that had seemed in the desperate arithmetic of that night, like the difference between living and dying. She had not known then that the horse belonged to Silas Dutton's barn manager. She had not known what that would mean. She knew now. The marshal raised his hand. The crowd went quiet. Clara closed her eyes and thought of Philadelphia. She thought of the way the Delaware River looked in summer, brown and wide and patient. She thought of the smell of bread from the bakery on Walnut Street. She thought with a clarity that surprised her that she was not ready, that whatever she had believed in those long years of ordinary surviving, that she did not want much, that she had learned not to want much, had been a lie she had told herself to make the smallness bearable. She wanted to live. She wanted it with everything she had. And then the sky cracked open. The thunder that rolled across the Nebraska flats was the kind that comes before you see the lightning, a deep chest-level concussion that Clara felt in her back teeth and in the soles of her feet through the platform boards. The horses at the hitching posts on both sides of the square erupted simultaneously. Most of them yanked and screamed and held. One of them, a big roan gelding tied to the post nearest the platform, did not hold. He snapped his rein like thread, reared once with his front hooves, raking the air, and then drove straight into the crowd. People scattered. The marshal turned. His hand left the lever. Clara did not think. Her body moved before the thought arrived. She dropped straight to her knees, felt the rope slide up and over the back of her skull as she dropped her chin, felt the rough hemp catch in her hair, and then release, and then she was rolling off the edge of the platform, falling the 5 feet down to the ground, and landing in the snow on her shoulder with a force that knocked the air from her lungs. She lay there for 1 second, 2. Then she heard someone shout. She ran. Her hands were still bound in front of her, but her feet were free, and Clara Weston ran the way she had run 3 weeks earlier from Dutton's ranch, not with a plan, not with a destination, but with the fundamental animal knowledge that stopping meant dying. She went for the tree line at the north end of the square. Behind her, she could hear the marshal's voice, controlled and hard, cutting through the noise of the crowd, and then the sound of horses. She hit the tree line and went in. The cottonwood forest along the river was dense in winter, the bare branches laced with old ice that caught what little light came through the storm clouds and broke it into gray and silver pieces. Clara crashed through the underbrush with her arms up to protect her face, her breath burning in and out, her feet finding and losing the ground in the uneven snow. She could hear the horses behind her. Two of them, maybe three, moving fast along the river trail. She went off the trail. She had grown up in a city. She did not know anything about tracking or counter-tracking or the way snow holds a footprint. What she knew, what some older and more fundamental part of her knew, was to go where the horses could not follow. She went between trees close enough together that the horses would have to go around. She went down into the gully where the ground dropped suddenly and the brush was thick enough to press through only on foot. She went hard and low and relentless, and after a time the sound of horses behind her faded, and then faded further, and then was swallowed by the rising wind. The snow was coming harder now. That was good. She did not let herself think about what came next. She had been a woman who planned once, who made careful lists of possibilities and arranged them in order of likelihood. That woman had answered a letter and signed a contract and stepped off a train in Nebraska with $12 and a head full of careful plans. She was not that woman right now. Right now, she was something simpler and more honest of body, moving forward through the cold, one foot, and then the next, the river on her left. The darkening sky above her, the smell of snow and frozen bark and distance. She followed the river north. She did not know how long she walked. The light dropped slowly, going from flat gray to darker gray to the dimness that comes just before the color leaves the sky entirely. Her hands had gone from pain to numbness, to something beyond numbness that she tried not to think about. Her feet were worse. She had good boots, Philadelphia boots fine-stitched, and they were not meant for this. She thought about stopping. She thought about lying down in the snow and closing her eyes and letting the cold finish what the gallows had started. It would not be difficult. It would not even hurt. She thought she had heard that freezing was peaceful, that after the initial cold there was warmth and then sleep. She thought about it the way you think about things you are not going to do. She kept walking. The ranch came into view in the last gray light of the afternoon. It was set back from the river behind a stand of pine trees that creaked and shifted in the wind, and the only reason she saw it at all was the smoke rising from the chimney, a thin gray column against a dark gray sky rising up and then being torn sideways by the wind. Below the smoke was the warm yellow light of a window. Clara stopped. She stood at the edge of the tree line with the snow blowing around her and looked at that light for a long moment. It looked like everything she had ever wanted and could not name. It looked like a trap. It looked like the only possible choice. She walked toward it. She made it to the porch steps. She did not make it up them. The man who opened the door was tall. That was what she registered first, the sheer height of him, the way he filled the door frame, the breadth of his shoulders blocking the light from inside. He had dark hair and dark eyes and the kind of face that had spent a great deal of time in the weather. He was perhaps 34, 35. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the cold, and he had the look of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something that required concentration. He looked down at her in the snow for a fraction of a second. Then his eyes went past her, past and wide, scanning the tree line in both directions with the quick measuring assessment of someone who knows how to read the land for danger. He held that scan for 3 full seconds. Then he came down off the porch. He crouched in the snow beside her. He looked at her face. He looked at the rope burns on her wrists. He looked with a stillness that was not absence of feeling, but something far more deliberate at the mark the gallows rope had left on her neck, a raw red line, not yet a bruise, running along her jaw and across the column of her throat. He did not say anything. He did not ask what happened or where she had come from or who she was. He slid one arm beneath her knees and lifted her. Inside the house, a younger man appeared from a doorway at the back, 25 or 26, sandy-haired, with an open, uncomplicated face that was at this moment wearing an expression of sharp alarm. He was already moving before the tall man spoke. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his eyes taking in Clara's condition with a speed that suggested this was not a man who needed things explained twice. "Get a knife," the tall man said. His voice was low, flat, and certain. "And heat some water." The younger one disappeared. The tall man carried Clara to the fireplace and lowered her into the chair closest to the hearth. The warmth hit her like something physical, a wall of heat that her frozen body did not know how to accept all at once. She felt her hands begin to shake again. She felt her jaw begin to shake. She felt the shaking move up through her chest, and she could not stop. It could not control any of it, and she was dimly aware that this was probably good, that the shaking meant she was still alive enough to respond. The younger man came back with a long-bladed knife. He worked quickly and carefully, sawing through the rope at her wrists. When the last fiber gave way, Clara felt the pain before she felt anything else. Hot rushing, excruciating pain as the blood returned to her hands. She made a sound she had not meant to make. The younger man wrapped both her hands in his and held them steady and firm, and said something she could not quite make out over the sound of her own heartbeat. The tall man pulled a second chair close to the hearth and sat. He did not ask questions. He did not say anything at all. He sat with his forearms resting on his knees, and he waited with a patience Clara had never encountered in a stranger, a patience that felt earned rather than performed, the patience of a man who had learned at some cost that most of the important things in the world cannot be rushed. She could not speak yet. Her teeth were still chattering, her hands still burning with returning circulation, her whole body still locked in the mechanical work of warming itself. So she sat in the chair and shook and let the fire do what the fire could do, and the two men sat with her, and the snow came down outside, and nobody said a word. The younger one got up, once disappeared to the kitchen, came back with a mug of something hot. He pressed it into her hands, both hands wrapped around it, making sure she had it before he let go. Coffee, thick and black and so hot she could barely hold it. She held it anyway. After a time, she did not know how long the shaking eased. "My name is Clara," she said. Her voice came out rough and wrong-scraped thin. "Clara Weston." The younger man nodded. His name, offered without hesitation, was Wyatt. Wyatt Ramsey. The tall man was his brother Cole. Cole Ramsey. He was watching her with those dark, steady eyes. Not with suspicion exactly, not with the hardness she had seen in the faces of every person in that crowd today. With something more careful than that. The look of a man who had learned to read faces the way other men read trail signs, and who was reading hers now. "They'll come looking for me," Clara said. "I expect they will." Cole's voice was low and even, with the unhurried cadence of a man who chose his words the way other men chose tools for the specific job, nothing extra. "You should turn me in." She looked at him directly. She thought she owed him that much. "Save yourself the trouble." "That depends," he said. "Did you do what they say you did?" "No." She held his eyes. "I took one horse off a fence post 2 miles from Dutton's ranch because I needed to get away from there and my feet were giving out. I didn't know whose it was. I didn't think. I just—" She stopped, took a breath. "No, I didn't steal anything." Cole was quiet for a moment. "What did you see?" he asked. Clara looked at him. She had not told anyone what she had seen. She had tried to tell the marshal when they arrested her, tried to explain, but Voss had listened with the careful blankness of a man hearing words he had decided in advance not to believe, and after a while she had stopped trying. She had sat in the cell and listened to the hammers and understood that it did not matter what she had seen. It mattered what Silas Dutton wanted, but Cole Ramsey was not Marshal Voss. He was sitting 3 feet away from her in a ranch house chair with the firelight moving across his face, and he was asking what she had seen, and something in the way he asked it, not with eagerness, not with the greedy curiosity of a man who wants a story, but with the focused attention of a man who needs information, made Clara understand that this question was not casual. She told him, all of it, the letter she had answered, the train from Philadelphia, Silas Dutton at the depot looking her over like livestock, the dinner at the long table, the room with the latch she tested 3 times, the voices at 3 in the morning, the window, the lantern light in the yard, the farmer with his hat in his hands, and the absolute terror on his face, the small motion of Dutton's hand, the shot, the running. Wyatt had stopped moving around the room. He stood by the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed over his chest and his jaw set, and by the time Clara finished, he looked like a man who was barely holding something in. Cole had not moved at all. When she finished, the room was very quiet except for the fire and the wind outside pressing against the window glass. Cole stood. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the dark for a long moment, his back to the room. Then he crossed to the desk in the corner, a heavy oak piece against the far wall, functional and scarred from years of use, and opened the bottom drawer. He placed a folder on the table. Clara looked at it. It was thick. The cover was worn at the corners, the kind of thickness that comes from papers accumulated over a long time. each one added carefully, none of them removed. That farmer's name was Howard Pell, Cole said. He was still standing, his hands resting on the back of the desk chair. He owned 40 acres east of the Dutton property. He'd been contesting a water rights claim for 2 years. He paused. He had a 14-year-old daughter. He was not the first man Dutton put in the ground for land he wanted. Clara stared at the folder. I was a deputy in this county for 4 years, Cole said. I stopped being a deputy 2 years ago because Silas Dutton asked me to look away from something I should not have looked away from. I would not do it. So I stopped. He looked at Clara across the room. Since then, I've been putting together what I know. Names, dates, things I saw, things other people told me, documents I've been able to get copies of. He paused again. There are 4 men in that folder who worked land Dutton wanted or knew things Dutton did not want known and who are not alive anymore. He looked at Clara steadily. You are the first living person who has seen Dutton give that order with their own eyes. Wyatt moved first. He crossed the room and put another log on the fire, and Clara could see him working through it, the bright, expressive face cycling through calculation and anger, and something that settled finally into a fierce resolution that looked very like his brother's. She needs a story, Wyatt said, before anyone comes here asking. Cole nodded slowly. He had already been thinking this. Clara could see that too, the way his eyes had gone slightly distant in the middle of the silence, the way certain men's eyes go when they are running through a problem from multiple angles at once. A name first, Cole said. Oh, not your own. Clara thought for a moment. Her mother's name. Ada. Ada Monroe. Missouri, Cole said, from a town near St. Louis. You don't remember the name of it. You moved around a lot as a child. No living family. You came west looking for work. He looked at her. You have been employed at this ranch for 6 weeks. You arrived at the end of October. If anyone checks the calendar against the weather, 6 weeks gets us back before the first hard snow. What about the men here? Clara asked. They'll be asked. Amos and Clem, Wyatt said. He almost smiled. Amos won't lie exactly, but he won't volunteer anything either. Amos is the most economical man I've ever known. He says the fewest words necessary and stops. The almost smile opened it and began writing something in the margin of the top page, a date and what appeared to be a name. He wrote with the focused economy of a man who had learned that details mattered, and imprecision was a kind of lie. She watched his hands. They were a working man's hands, broad through the palm, with the calluses that come from rope and leather and the daily physical demands of running cattle through hard country. But the way they moved across the page was precise, careful, the hands of a man who had learned 2 completely different languages and spoke both of them fluently. She fell asleep in the chair. She did not mean to. The warmth and the food Wyatt had pressed into her hands without asking whether she wanted it, bread and cold beef and an apple, and the simple animal relief of being inside rather than outside in the dark, had accumulated to something her body could not resist. She woke once briefly to find that someone had placed a quilt over her and moved her boots close to the fire to dry. The fire had been built up. The lamp on the desk was still lit, and Cole was still at the desk, still working, his profile lit warm and steady against the dark of the room. She slept again. When she woke in the morning, pale winter light was coming through the window, and she could smell coffee and something frying in the kitchen. For exactly 1 second, she did not know where she was, and the confusion was almost pleasant, a blank suspended moment of not knowing. Then she touched her throat. Then she remembered. 5 days passed. They were careful days, deliberate days, the kind of days that have a shape and a purpose, days built around a plan rather than simply moving forward through time. Clara Ada Monroe, she reminded herself again and again, fell into the work of the household because there was nothing else she could do, and because keeping her hands occupied kept her mind from going to the places it wanted to go. She learned the kitchen, the pantry, the careful way Cole organized the shelves by weight and frequency of use. She failed spectacularly to make biscuits on the second morning, and Wyatt's face when he looked at the small, dense objects on the pan was a study in heroic diplomacy. They're fine, he said. They're like river stones, Clara said. He picked one up, knocked it against the table, experimentally looked at her. Smaller river stones, he offered. She laughed. It came out sudden and surprised, like something that had not been expecting to get out. Cole took over breakfast without comment, moving around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a man who had fed himself and his brother for a long time and had long since made peace with the fact that someone had to do it. Amos Briggs had received the news with precisely the expression Wyatt had predicted: a single measured nod, a long look at Clara that was neither hostile nor particularly warm, and then, "I don't know any woman by that name." 4 words. Then he went back to work. Clem Wilder was 22 and talkative and visibly excited by the drama of it until Cole fixed him with a look that communicated without any words at all that being excited about a woman's life being in danger was not an appropriate response. Clem sobered quickly after that and became, if anything, over-careful, greeting Clara every morning with a courtly formality that she suspected he had borrowed from some novel. On the fifth day, Marshal Gideon Voss rode up the front track with 2 deputies behind him. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the horses. She felt the sound in the base of her sternum before she heard it with her ears, a low, physical alarm, the body knowing before the mind catches up. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall, breathed. Cole appeared in the doorway. "Remember," he said quietly. His eyes were steady. "6 weeks, Missouri, Ada Monroe. You have nothing to hide." He held her gaze for a moment longer, just a moment, but long enough that she understood it was not only instruction, but something else, something that did not have a name yet in the vocabulary of the 5 days she had known him. Then he went to the door. She picked up the laundry basket. She made herself fold. She listened. Voss's voice on the porch, professional, careful, doing the job. Cole's voice level, unhurried, the voice of a man who has done nothing wrong and knows it and does not feel the need to be elaborate about it. Footsteps on the porch, then on the floor. They came into the kitchen. Voss was taller than she remembered from the gallows. He moved the way lawmen sometimes move, with the alert stillness of someone who is always taking stock of their environment, counting exits and angles. His eyes went to her immediately and stayed there, and Clara kept her hands moving on the laundry and met his gaze with the expression she had practiced every morning in the small mirror in the spare room: pleasant, unsurprised, mildly curious. The face of a woman who has been folding laundry in this kitchen for 6 weeks and sees no particular reason to be otherwise. "This is Ada Monroe," Cole said. "She's been helping with the house since October." Voss looked at her for a long time. Clara looked back. She was aware of her pulse in her fingertips. She was aware of the rope mark on her neck, now faded to a yellowish bruise, and she had angled herself so the light from the window fell on her right side rather than her left. She was aware of every breath she was taking and the necessity of making each one look like something that cost her nothing. "Evening, Miss," Voss said. "Marshall," Clara said. He watched her fold a dish towel. He looked at the orderly kitchen, the stocked shelves, the banked stove, all the evidence of a household that had been in competent hands for some weeks. His eyes moved over it the way a careful man's eyes move, not missing things, but not finding them either. Then he looked at Cole. "We're looking for an escaped prisoner," he said. "Woman by the name of Clara Weston. She ran during—" a pause, the briefest one. "During an execution 5 days ago. Storm might have got her. We're checking the ranches anyway." "Haven't seen anyone come through," Cole said, "but you're welcome to look around if you need to." Voss did. He was thorough. He went through the house room by room, not destructively, but completely opening doors and looking inside. He went to the barn. He talked to Amos, whose responses were apparently brief enough to be useless. He talked to Clem, who was so earnest in his confirmation that Ada Monroe had been here since October, that Clara, listening from the kitchen, had a moment of genuine anxiety before Wyatt smoothly redirected the conversation. When Voss came back through the kitchen to leave, he paused at the door. He looked at Clara once more. She was hanging dish towels on the rack by the stove. He looked at her neck. She did not move. She did not change her expression. She hung the towel and reached for the next one. Voss looked away. He moved toward the front door. Cole followed him out. Clara listened to the voices on the porch, low, indistinct, the tone of men speaking quietly about something they are not speaking loudly about. Then the sound of horses. Then silence. Wyatt appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Well," Wyatt said finally. "Well," Clara said. She sat down. Her legs had decided without consulting her that they were finished holding her up for the time being. Then Cole came back inside. He walked through the front room to the kitchen without speaking, and Clara looked up, and something in his face told her that what Voss had said on the porch was not the nothing it had appeared to be. Cole set a small piece of paper on the kitchen table. Clara picked it up, 7 words written in a spare, angular hand. He didn't come alone. Watch your perimeter tonight. She looked up. Voss left that on the porch railing, Cole said, under his boot. I almost missed it. She read it again. He didn't come alone. She set the paper down. She looked at Cole and then at Wyatt, and she said with a steadiness in her voice that she was surprised to find she actually meant, then we better figure out what comes next. Outside, the last light was going out of the sky, and somewhere in the dark beyond the tree line, something was moving through the snow. That night, Cole Ramsey did not sleep. Clara knew this because she did not sleep either, and from the narrow bed in the spare room, she could hear him, or rather could hear the absence of him in the house, the quality of silence that comes from a building where someone is outside rather than in. Every hour or so, she heard the soft creak of the porch boards, the low sound of Amos and Cole exchanging a few words below her window, the silence settling again. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the snow. In the morning, she came downstairs and found Cole at the kitchen table with the folder open and a cup of coffee that had long gone cold at his elbow, and the dark circles under his eyes were the only evidence that the night had been anything other than ordinary. He looked up when she came in, assessed her the way he always did, quickly, completely, and then moving on and said that Wyatt had gone to check the north fence line and that there was coffee on the stove. She poured a cup. She sat across from him. Who was out there? She asked. Don't know yet. He turned a page in the folder. Tracks in the snow, north of the side of the barn. Whoever it was came close enough to look in through the gap in the boards, then went back the way they came. He paused. They knew which way to approach to stay out of the sight line from the house windows. Clara wrapped both hands around her mug. That's not a coincidence, she said. No, Cole said. It isn't. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the morning was pale and still, the kind of winter morning that looks peaceful from inside a warm room. Then we should assume they'll be back, Clara said. Cole looked at her. Something shifted briefly in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, the look of a man adjusting an assumption he had not known he was making. Yes, he said, we should. The days that followed had 2 layers. The surface layer was ordinary, deliberate, the kind of normal that is built rather than simply lived, where every action is also a statement. We have nothing to hide. There is nothing unusual here. This is what an ordinary ranch household looks like in December. Clara cooked or tried to and accepted Cole's silent corrections with what she hoped was grace. She cleaned. She learned the rhythms of a working cattle operation, the early dark mornings when Cole and Amos rode out to check on the herd, the midday pause when Wyatt came in from whatever task had taken him to the far edges of the property, the evenings when they sat around the table and ate together, and the conversation was simple and functional, and occasionally without warning funny. She learned the way the 3 men related to each other, Cole at the center, steady as a post driven deep into solid ground, the fixed point around which the work of the ranch organized itself. Wyatt orbiting loosely, bringing energy and noise, and an effortless sociability that Clara understood after a few days was not shallow. It was deliberate kindness. Wyatt Ramsey had decided somewhere along the way that making people feel welcome was a form of work worth doing, and he did it with the same seriousness that Cole brought to the cattle records and Amos brought to the fence lines. Clem mostly stayed out of the way and tried very hard not to be interesting, which had the paradoxical effect of making him more interesting than he would otherwise have been. The deeper layer was something else. It was the second layer that Clara paid attention to because the second layer was where the real information was. It was in the way Cole came into whatever room she was working in and stood for a moment before finding a reason to go back out. It was in the way Wyatt always seemed to know when she needed someone to talk to versus when she needed to be left alone and acted accordingly. It was in the way both brothers watched her when they thought she wasn't watching them, not with suspicion, not anymore, but with something she did not yet have a word for. On the 4th morning, Wyatt found her standing at the kitchen window holding a coffee cup and staring at the snow-covered fields with an expression she had apparently not managed to arrange into something neutral before he came in. Teach you something, he said. She turned. What? Come on. He was already pulling on his coat. He taught her to saddle a horse properly, not the panicked, one-handed fumbling she had done the night she fled Dutton's ranch. He showed her how to read the feel of the cinch, how to check the stirrups, how to approach a nervous animal from the side and speak to it below the register of alarm. He talked the whole time easy and unhurried, filling the air with information and small jokes in the comfortable chatter of someone who had grown up working alongside other people and knew how to make the work feel like company. Clara paid attention. She asked questions. She was a fast learner when the subject mattered, and she understood somewhere beneath the surface of the lesson that this mattered. "You sat a horse before," Wyatt observed on the third try. "In Philadelphia." She adjusted the stirrup. "Woody's riding lessons. They taught us to post-trot in a ring and look serene. And here you are." "Here I am." She looked at the horse, a bay mare whose name Wyatt had told her she would not remember. "Rather different," Wyatt grinned. "Everything out here is rather different." He handed her the reins. "But the horse is the same. The horse doesn't know you're in Nebraska." Cole taught her differently. He did not plan lessons. He simply went about his work and explained what he was doing when she was nearby, and it seemed relevant to explain. And Claire realized after a while that this was for Cole Ramsey an unusual thing. He was not a man who narrated. He was not a man who taught easily because teaching required attention to the student, and Cole's natural attention moved outward to the land, to the weather, to the 100 small indicators of condition and change that a rancher in Nebraska winter had to read constantly to keep his animals and his property intact. But he explained how to read the sky for incoming weather. He showed her the color at the horizon that meant snow within 6 hours and the different color that meant a warm front coming up from the south. He told her what the behavior of the cattle in the north pasture indicated about the temperature that night, and she listened and filed it away, with the focused seriousness of a woman who understood that information in this landscape was a form of survival. One evening he came in and found her looking at the maps on his desk, the topographic sheets he had marked with trails and fence lines and water sources, and instead of closing them, he stood beside her and explained what the markings meant. And they stood there for 20 minutes looking at the land she now lived in. And when he finally straightened up and stepped back, Clara was aware in the part of her mind that tracked such things that his shoulder had been 6 inches from hers for 20 minutes, and neither of them had moved away. On the 6th day, Clem came in from the afternoon feed and reported with the surface nonchalance of someone who does not want to look afraid that there were fresh boot prints behind the grain store. Cole set down his fork. "Same size as before?" he asked. "Looks like." "How fresh?" "Hour, maybe 2. Cole looked at Amos. Amos nodded once and got up from the table and went out without taking his coat, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how seriously he was taking it. That night was the 6th night, and Clara had been making something out of it without quite meaning to. 6 days in this house. 6 days of careful, ordinary living, of being Ada Monroe from Missouri, of folding laundry and failing at biscuits and watching the brothers work and listening to Wyatt's stories and reading the land through Cole's eyes. And something in her had shifted in ways she was trying not to examine too closely because examining them seemed dangerous. After dinner, Wyatt fell asleep in the chair by the fire, the way he sometimes did, after a long day deeply and without apparent awareness that he was doing it like a man who had made peace with every circumstance of his life and could therefore sleep anywhere. He was asleep within 10 minutes and snoring lightly, his long legs stretched toward the hearth. Clara was washing the dinner dishes. Cole came to dry. This had become a thing over the 6 days without either of them deciding it was a thing. She washed, he dried, and the kitchen was small enough that there was no way to do it without being aware of the other person at very close range. They were usually quiet, or Wyatt was talking from the other room, or one of them said something practical about the following day's work. Tonight, Wyatt was asleep and the house was quiet. Clara was washing a skillet, and she was thinking about the boot prints behind the grain store, and she was thinking about Marshall Voss's note and what it might mean that Silas Dutton had sent someone to watch the ranch before doing anything else. She was thinking about the heft of her contract still folded inside the lining of her coat where she had put it the night she fled Dutton's ranch, and about the terrible irony of carrying a document she had once thought was her salvation, and now could not decide was an anchor or a key. And she was thinking about the fact that she was standing in this kitchen, in this house in Nebraska, with the snow coming down outside, and that she was not afraid the way she had been afraid, not the constant physical fear of the cell and the gallows and the running, and that the absence of that fear had left room for other things to fill the space, and some of those other things were frightening in a completely different way. Cole took the skillet from her hands. She did not mean to cry him. She had made a point in these 6 days of not crying. She had done her crying in the cell. She had used it up, and what was left now was something more functional. But the warmth and the quiet and the smell of the kitchen and the simple fact of someone taking a skillet from her hands without being asked, because they could see she was holding it more tightly than a skillet, needed to be held. Something in all of that reached past the functional part of her and got to something underneath. She stood at the sink with her eyes filling up and her hands still in the dishwater and said nothing. Cole set the skillet down. He turned to face her. "Tell me," he said. "It's nothing, May," Clara managed. She blinked hard. She stopped, took a breath. "I realized that this is the first time in a long while I could breathe." She looked up at him. "I keep waiting for it to go away." Cole looked at her for a moment. Behind them, Wyatt's breathing in the other room was steady and deep, the sound of someone entirely untroubled by the world. "It won't," Cole said. It was 2 words. It was possibly the least elaborate thing anyone could have said. But the way he said it, the quiet certainty of it, the same certainty he brought to everything he said so that his words never exceeded what he was prepared to guarantee, made Clara believe him in a way that elaborate promises would not have. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She took the skillet back and hung it on the rack. Cole picked up the dish towel again, and they finished the rest in silence. And the silence was the kind that does not require filling. On the 7th night, it was Amos who heard the noise. He had a gift for it, the stillness of a man who had lived alone on the frontier long enough that his sleeping mind had learned to parse the ambient sounds of a ranch at night and recognize the note that didn't belong. He was awake and at the barn door in the time it would have taken most men to find their boots, and what he found in the barn was a man crouched over Cole's locked storage chest in the corner stall, a man who had come in through the low window above the feed bins, who had clearly known exactly where to look and exactly what he was looking for. Clara was awake when they brought him in. She had heard the commotion from her room, not the details, but the shape of it, the controlled urgency of men moving fast in the dark outside, and she was dressed and at the top of the stairs by the time Cole and Wyatt came through the front door with the man between them. He was perhaps 40 thick through the neck, with a flat, weathered face that wore the expression of a man who has been caught and has moved past the phase of denial into the phase of calculating what he can still salvage from the situation. His coat was the good wool of a man with steady work, and there was a silver deputy's badge in his shirt pocket, not on it, but in it, which was the detail that made Wyatt's jaw tighten. Cole sat him in the chair by the fire. He stood over him with his arms crossed and looked at him for a long time without speaking. "Burl," Cole said finally. "Cole." The man Burl Nesbitt said it back with a careful neutrality, like they were meeting on a street in town. Clara came down the stairs. Neither brother told her to go back up. "You were looking for the folder," Cole said. "Silas wants it back." "It's not Silas's folder. Silas doesn't see it that way." Burl shifted in the chair. His eyes moved to Clara, and he assessed her the way men like him assessed unfamiliar variables quickly and without warmth. Cole's voice did not change. "Eyes on me, Burl." Burl looked back at Cole. "You were a deputy for 11 years, Cole said. "I was." No apology in it. No shame that Clara could find. Just acknowledgement, the way a man acknowledges the weather. "And now you're breaking into barns for Silas Dutton." Burl was quiet for a moment. Then something moved in his face, not conscience exactly, but the ghost of it, like the outline left in snow after something has been moved away. "A man makes choices," he said. "You made yours. I made mine." Cole looked at him steadily. "Howard Pell had a daughter," he said. 14 years old, you knew that." The ghost in Burl's face became something more present. He looked down at his laced fingers. The silence in the room had weight. When he looked back up, he had the expression of a man who has been carrying something a long time and has run out of place to set it down. "I knew that," he said. "You came here to burn those papers. I came here to retrieve them." He met Cole's eyes. "There's a difference." "There is not," Cole said. Another silence. Then Burl placed both palms flat on his knees, deliberate and resigned. "You should know," he said, "that Silas is not coming here for the girl alone." His eyes moved to Clara and then back to Cole. "He knows what you've been putting together for 2 years. He knows what's in that folder. You should have burned it yourself a long time ago, Ramsey, but you didn't, and now he's coming here with 6 men and a warrant signed by Judge Albright. A pause. Albright signed it this morning. Silas left Kearney this afternoon. Storm slowed them. They'll camp overnight at the Hollister Creek crossing. He looked back at Cole. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock if the trail's passable. Nobody spoke. Howard Pell's girl was the same age as my niece, Burl said. He said it quietly, looking at nothing in particular. That's all I've got to say about it. He leaned back in the chair. The rest is your business. Cole looked at him for a long moment. Then Amos. Amos appeared from the kitchen doorway as though he had been there the whole time which he possibly had been. Cole looked at him. Amos nodded and went to take Burl's arm, and Burl rose from the chair without resistance and went with Amos toward the bunkhouse, and then it was just Cole and Wyatt and Clara in the firelit room. Wyatt was the first to speak. 6 men. And Albright's warrant, Cole said. He had not moved from where he stood. Albright's warrant doesn't get past the territory line if we reach Cheyenne first. Wyatt looked at his brother. You've been saying that for 2 years. The federal judge in Cheyenne, we'd need to get there. Cole turned and looked at the window, the old habit of reading the outside dark from the inside. 6 days in good weather, more in this. Clara was standing at the foot of the stairs. She had been standing there since she came down, and she had been listening, and there was something moving around in the back of her mind, something that had been there since Cole laid the folder on the table the first night and said the word witnesses, and now it came forward and arranged itself with a clarity that surprised her. I have the contract, she said. Both brothers looked at her. The mail-order bride contract. I've had it since I left Dutton's ranch. She crossed the room and went to her coat hanging by the door and reached into the lining and pulled out the folded papers. She laid them on the table. Cole came to look. The contract was 4 pages dense with the careful language of the Philadelphia Employment Agency terms of transportation, terms of household provision, terms of dissolution. Clara turned to the last page. Near the bottom in the smaller print below the signature lines was a clause that she had read half a dozen times in the boarding house on Chestnut Street before she signed, because she had been a careful young woman who read what she signed. She put her finger on the paragraph. Cole read it. His eyes moved slowly, taking in the language, and she watched his face change, not dramatically, because nothing in Cole Ramsey's face changed dramatically, but with that same small recalibration she had seen on the first morning, the adjustment of an assumption. In the event that the contracting male party is found to have committed a felony offense prior to the date of union, the contracting female party reserves the right to nullify this agreement and seek remedy before a court of competent jurisdiction. A court of competent jurisdiction, Cole said. Which Albright is not, Wyatt said, reading over his brother's shoulder. But a federal judge in Cheyenne is. Cole straightened. He looked at Clara. You've been carrying this since that night. I didn't know why I took it, she said. She stopped. My hands took it before I thought it through. Something moved through Cole's expression that was gone before she could name it. He looked back down at the contract, then at the folder beside it, the 2 years of careful documentation, the names and dates and testimony he had been building in a drawer while he waited for something he could not have predicted. Together, he said, these are enough. He was not speaking to either of them in particular. He was working through it aloud the way a man checks his figures. The contract gives her legal standing. The folder gives the federal court the pattern. Howard Pell, the others. A jury in Cheyenne doesn't owe Silas Dutton anything. We leave before morning, Wyatt said, before Silas reaches the Hollister crossing. Before dawn, Cole agreed. That night before she slept, Clara went out. She did not plan it. She put on her coat and her boots, and she went out the back door and stood on the steps in the cold, and the snow had stopped, and the sky had cleared, and the stars above the Nebraska flats were extraordinary. The kind of stars you cannot see from a city, more stars than sky, the cold air making them sharp and present, rather than distant. She heard him come out behind her. She had not heard the door, but she heard the change in the quality of the silence, the way the air moves differently when another person is in it. Cole came to stand beside her at the porch railing. He looked up at the ski. He was not wearing a coat she had noticed. He was rarely cold, or rather rarely appeared cold, which she suspected was not the same thing. I need to tell you something, Clara said. All right. She looked at the stars. I wasn't running away from a hanging when I knocked on your door. She paused. I mean, I was. But before that, I was running away from something I'd seen, from what I knew. She turned to look at him. And I think I was also running because I had never in my whole life done one single thing that was only mine. Every choice I made was because of something someone else needed or something circumstances required. And when that rope slipped over my head and I had the 1 second to decide, she stopped, took a breath. I think I chose to survive because I wanted to find out what a choice that was entirely mine felt like. Cole was quiet for a moment. And, he said, and now I think I know. She looked back at the stars, standing in your kitchen learning how to read the sky, failing at biscuits. A pause. This is what it feels like. She heard him exhale slow and deliberate the way he did when he was deciding something. She did not look at him. When I was a deputy, he said after a moment, I believed in the law the way some men believe in God. Not blindly, but completely. He leaned on the railing looking out across the dark fields. And then I watched Silas Dutton do something that the law could not touch, and I understood that the law is only as good as the people who hold it. He paused. So I stopped holding it. I started doing something else instead. Collecting evidence. Waiting, he said, for the right moment, for something that couldn't be ignored. He turned to look at her. I waited 2 years. She met his eyes. I know, she said. They stood there while longer, the cold settling around them, the stars burning overhead with that winter intensity that made them look close enough to touch. Then Cole said quietly, go sleep. We leave before first light. They did not leave before first light. The delay was Wyatt's horse. The animal had thrown a shoe sometime in the night, a discovery made in the dark by lantern. Clem crouching in the stall and running his hand down the leg with the focused attention of a young man who understands that a lame horse on the open Nebraska plain in winter is not a problem, but a catastrophe. Reshoeing in darkness took the better part of an hour. By the time Wyatt's horse was sound and saddled and the last of their supplies were loaded, the sky to the east had begun its slow, gray-blue transition from night. Cole stood at the window and read that sky the way he read everything, without panic, without hurry, with the calculating assessment of a man who needs accurate information more than he needs reassurance. We have time, he said finally, but not much. We move now. They moved, and then Silas Dutton arrived at 7. The sound of horses, multiple horses moving at a purposeful trot, came across the frozen ground long before they were visible, and Clara heard it from inside the house where she was gathering the last of what she could carry. Her hands went still. She heard Cole's boots on the stairs, the rhythm of a man moving fast but not panicking. He appeared in the doorway. Stay inside, he said, until I tell you different. She stayed inside. She watched from the window. There were 8 of them. Silas Dutton rode at the front on a gray horse, and he looked in the thin morning light exactly as she remembered, large and self-contained, and wholly certain that the world arranged itself according to his preferences. Beside him on a bay gelding was Marshal Gideon Voss, and even at this distance Clara could read the tension in the marshal's posture, the stiffness of a man performing a role he is not comfortable in. 6 men ranged behind them, hard men. You could identify them by the way they held their reins loose and confident, the hands of people who were not afraid of what came next. Cole went to the fence. He stood with his thumbs in his belt and watched them come up the track, and he did not move, and his posture did not change. And Clara thought that this was one of the things about Cole Ramsey that was most essentially himself, that he could stand still in the face of a thing and let the thing come to him, and that there was in this not passivity, but something much more formidable than that. Silas pulled up his horse at the fence line. He looked at Cole for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to the house. Ramsey, he said. Dutton, Cole said. You know why I'm here. I expect I do. Silas reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. Judge Albright's warrant. Search and seizure. I want my property. His eyes went to the house again. Both kinds. Cole did not look at the paper. He looked at Voss. Voss was looking at the paper. Clara could see it from the window. Voss sitting his horse with the warrant extended in Cole's general direction, and his eyes on it with the expression of a man who is reading something he had not bothered to read before, and is finding the contents instructive. Marshal Voss, Cole said. Not loud, not aggressive, with a patience that was almost worse than anger. Do you want to examine that warrant before you act on it? Silas's head turned sharply. Voss looked up. He looked at Cole. He looked at his cousin. He looked at the warrant in his hand. Clara held her breath. The silence stretched across the frozen yard for a long moment, and in it, she heard everything, the creak of saddle leather, the slow breath of horses, the distant sound of cattle in the north pasture, and underneath all of it, the sound of a man deciding something he could not undecide. The date, Voss said. His voice was flat and professional. This warrant is dated yesterday. Silas's jaw tightened. What of it? A search and seizure warrant requires 48 hours notice served to the resident. Voss folded the paper. His face was perfectly neutral, the face of a man doing his job by the letter, and absolutely nothing else. I cannot execute this warrant until tomorrow morning. Dead silence. Silas looked at his martial cousin with eyes that had gone very cold and very still. Gideon, he said. I'm sorry, Silas, Voss said. He was not sorry. Clara could see even at this distance that he was not sorry. He was terrified and resolute in equal measure, the expression of a man who has decided to do the right thing and is paying the price of that decision in real time. I follow the law. That's what you pay me for. He looked at Cole, then just for a second, and the look said, This is all I can give you. Don't waste it. We'll be back tomorrow, Silas said. He turned his horse. 6 men turned with him. At first light. We'll be here, Cole said. He said it with perfect calm, and Clara, watching from the window, understood that he was lying and that it was the most beautiful lie she had ever heard. They left at midnight. The moon was 3/4 full, and the snow reflected it back up at the sky, which meant they could move fast on the open ground, but that they were also visible, and Cole knew this and built it into the route he took them south first toward the river, then cut west through the timber belt, where the trees threw shadow enough to break up their outline against the snow. Amison and Clem stayed. This had been agreed without much discussion. The ranch needed someone to hold it, and if Silas arrived in the morning and found 2 ranch hands who knew nothing of where their employers had gone, that was its own kind of information. Amos had received the assignment with his customary economy of expression. Clem had looked slightly wounded until Wyatt put a hand on his shoulder and said something in a low voice that Clara couldn't hear, after which Clem straightened up and nodded with the bearing of a young man who has been told his role matters. They were an hour out when the riders found them. 2 men scouts Silas had left in the timber, belt Clara realized men placed there against exactly this possibility. They came out of the trees at a canter, and for a moment Clara's heart went into the high wild register of pure fear, and then Cole's horse stepped sideways, and Wyatt was already moving, and it became something else, not a pursuit but a confrontation, the horses of 5 people churning up the snow in the dark. The shot came from the left. Clara felt Wyatt's horse flinch before she understood what had happened, and then Wyatt made a sound, a short controlled sound, the sound of someone absorbing pain and refusing to give it more than that, and she looked and saw him sitting his horse with his right hand pressed to his left shoulder and the dark spreading there. What happened next was very fast and involved Cole doing something with his horse and his voice and the weight of his presence that she could not entirely follow, and then the scouts were gone, not ridden down, not shot, just gone, turned back into the darkness, the way men sometimes go when they encounter something that makes the calculation of pursuit no longer favorable. Cole was beside Wyatt immediately. How bad, he said. Went through. Wyatt's voice was tight but steady. Clean. Can you ride? A pause. Yes. Then ride. They rode. Clara pulled close to Wyatt's left side and rode close enough that her stirrup knocked his every few strides, and he did not tell her to move back, and she did not move back. After a while, he straightened in the saddle, and the tension in his face eased slightly, and he said without looking at her, I'm all right. I know, Clara said. They stopped 2 hours later in a hollow between 2 low hills, where the wind didn't reach and the trees were close enough on 3 sides to provide cover. Cole built a small fire, small enough not to be seen from distance, large enough to matter. He handed Clara his saddlebag. Clean cloth middle pocket, he said, and the small bottle. She found them. She went to Wyatt and cut away the shoulder of his coat with Cole's knife. He watched her do it with the bemused expression of a man not entirely convinced this is a good idea, and she cleaned the wound by firelight with hands that shook on the first pass and steadied on the second. Wyatt hissed once. Sorry, Clara said. You're doing fine. His voice was strained but genuine. "You're actually doing fine." She bound it tight the way her landlady had once shown her the summer a man at the boarding house had cut himself badly with a kitchen knife, and there had been no doctor available for 3 hours. The knot was not elegant. It would hold. Wyatt looked down at it, then up at her. His face in the firelight was pale from the blood loss and the cold, but the smile that he produced was characteristically undeterred by circumstances. "You know," he said, "this is the first time in my life I've been glad to be shot." Clara shook her head. She tried not to smile. She failed. "You're terrible," she told him. "I've been told." He leaned back against the tree behind him. "Cole's going to say we need to keep moving." "He's right. He usually is." Wyatt closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Clara." She looked at him. "We're going to get there," he said. "Cheyenne, the federal judge, all of it." He said it with the matter-of-fact certainty that was she had come to understand how Wyatt Ramsey expressed the things he felt most deeply. "You should know that." She finished tying the bandage. "I know," she said. From the edge of the firelight, Cole watched them. He was sitting with his back to a tree and his rifle across his knees, watching the dark in the way a man watches when he is responsible for what the dark might contain, and his face held an expression that he did not know he was wearing, that he would not have allowed himself to wear if he had known. Clara saw it. She did not say anything about it. She put away the cloth and the bottle, and she sat beside Wyatt and looked into the fire. And the fire was small, and the dark was large, and Cheyenne was 6 days away through the winter, and none of that seemed impossible. Not tonight. Not with these two men in this hollow in the dark, the horses breathing steady beside them, and the stars burning overhead, and somewhere behind them, Alice Dutton, arriving at an empty ranch in the cold gray of first light. They had done what needed to be done. They were moving toward what came next. And Clara Weston, for the first time since the rope had settled around her neck in the Kearney Town Square, was not running away from something. She was running toward it. There was a difference she had discovered that you could feel all the way down to your bones. That night, Cole did not sleep. Clara knew this because she did not sleep either, and from where she lay in the hollow, she could hear him, the small, precise sounds of a man maintaining a fire and a watch in the dark. Every hour or so, she heard the quiet exchange between him and the horses, the way he would speak to them in a low register to keep them settled, and then the silence would close back over everything again. In the morning, Cole was at the fire with the coffee already made, and the dark circles under his eyes were the only evidence of the night he had kept. He looked up when she came to sit beside him, moved slightly to make room, and they were quiet together for a while in the way they had learned to be quiet, not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who understand that some hours do not require conversation to fill them. "How much of the night did you sleep?" she asked. "Enough." That's not an answer. Something in his face shifted the almost movement that was she had come to understand Cole Ramsey's version of a smile. "Some," he said, "a few hours." "You should have woken me. I could have—" "You needed to sleep." He turned a piece of wood in the fire with a stick, adjusting the angle. "You did something useful last night. That uses more than people realize." She thought about Wyatt's shoulder, the shaking of her hands on the first pass and the steadying on the second. "I didn't know I could do that." "Most people don't know what they can do until they have to." He looked at the fire. "You keep finding out." They broke camp before sunrise and rode south by southeast, following the route Cole had mapped in his head, over 2 years of knowing this territory, not the main trails which Silas Dutton knew as well as anyone, but the secondary lines, the old buffalo traces, and seasonal cattle drives that cut across the flats at angles the main roads ignored. Wyatt rode without complaint, which told Clara more about his pain than complaint would have. On the first morning, she caught him adjusting his grip on the reins with a carefulness that he immediately made casual when he noticed her watching, and she made a point of not watching after that, because some dignities matter more when they go unremarked. He talked instead. Wyatt talked the way some men breathe continuously, necessarily as though silence were a condition to be managed rather than accepted. He told her about growing up on the Nebraska flats with Cole, their father's cattle operation, the boyhood shaped by large sky and hard winters, in the company of working animals. He told her about the traveling show he had joined at 17, a theatrical company making its way through the territory, staging melodramas and variety acts in whatever building was large enough to hold a crowd. 3 days, he said, riding beside her through a stand of bare cottonwoods. 3 days before I was so homesick I couldn't eat. The ringmaster, a man named August Fell, which I always thought was exactly the right name for a showman, told me I had a gift for making people comfortable and that the theater needed people like that. He paused. Then he told me I was also the worst actor he had ever seen in 30 years of working with amateurs. Clara laughed. The sound went up into the cold air and dispersed. Both things were true. Oh, Wyatt said, satisfied. Cole, riding ahead, had turned his head slightly at the sound of her laughing. Just slightly. Just enough. On the third day, the weather changed. The warm front Cole had been watching in the southern sky for 2 days finally arrived, bringing with it a softening of the air that was almost shocking after the hard cold, a looseness, a moistness, the smell of water rather than ice. The snow on the open ground began to develop a crust that glittered in the thin sunlight, and by mid-afternoon the icicles on the rocks along the creek they followed were dripping. They made better time. Wyatt's shoulder was improving. The bandage held the redness around the wound was fading rather than spreading, and by the third morning he had stopped holding the reins with the adjusted grip. He did not mention this. Clara noticed it and also did not mention it, but she felt something in her chest release that she had not realized she had been holding. On the fourth evening, they camped in a shallow canyon where the walls cut the wind and the dry grass under the snow provided good forage for the horses. Cole built the fire in the bowl of a flat rock that amplified the heat, and Clara made coffee competently now, the campfire method having resolved itself into something she understood after 3 nights of practice. And they sat with their cups and watched the fire, and for a while nobody needed to speak. The stars came out early. Cole pointed at the sky. He had been doing this on the road, pointing out stars, naming their patterns, explaining the relationships between them with the same precise care he brought to everything he explained. He was not romantic about it. He did not describe the sky in the language of wonder. He described it in the language of navigation, what each configuration meant in terms of direction, what it told a man on open ground about where he was and where he was going. That one, he said, pointing southeast, is where you want to be watching in late fall. The angle of those 3 stars relative to the horizon tells you within 2 hours what the temperature will be by midnight. How did you learn that? Claire asked. My father. He lowered his hand. He was not a man who talked much, but he knew the sky the way other men know books. A pause. Twins. He said a man who could read the sky and read the land would never be truly lost. Were you ever lost? He thought about it. Once. When I was 12, storm came in faster than I expected out on the east pasture, and I lost the fence line. He was quiet for a moment. I sat still and waited. The storm broke in about 2 hours, and I could see the stars again. And then I went home. Wyatt, who had been lying on his back with his hat over his face in the posture of a man who was possibly asleep, but was certainly not said from under the hat. He came home and didn't tell anyone what happened, and I didn't find out until I was 16, and he mentioned it like it was nothing. It was nothing, Cole said. I came home. Clara looked between them, the taciturn older brother and the expressive younger one. The two of them fitting together in a way that was so natural it looked inevitable, each one the specific shape that filled the space the other left. She thought about Philadelphia, about the boarding house and the thin mattress and the landlady who raised the rent every winter. She thought about the advertisement she had answered and the careful, hopeful letter she had sent, and the answer she had received, the answer she now knew had not been from Silas Dutton, but from a man sitting 3 feet away from her on the other side of a campfire in Wyoming. Cole, she said. He looked at her. When you wrote back to my advertisement. She paused. What made you answer it? The fire popped. Wyatt's hat did not move. Cole was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, might let the question go the way he let some things go into the silence, where he kept the things that were too large or too important for casual examination. The way you wrote it, he said finally. She waited. Most of those advertisements. He stopped, started again. They read like inventories, what the woman can offer, what she's willing to accept, the practical terms. He looked at the fire. Yours said that you were looking for somewhere that felt like it was yours, that you'd never had that. He paused. That's not something a woman says unless she means it. Clara looked at the fire. She remembered writing that. She remembered sitting at the small desk in her room on Chestnut Street with the newspaper open in front of her and the pen in her hand going through 3 drafts before she said the thing she actually meant, instead of the thing that sounded appropriate. She remembered thinking as she folded the final version that she had been too honest, that honesty was a liability in such things that she should rewrite it to sound more practical and less like a woman admitting something she probably shouldn't admit. She had sent it anyway. I almost rewrote it, she said. I know, Cole said. You could tell. He looked at her. I'm glad you didn't. Wyatt's hat shifted. He put it on his face more firmly and appeared to go to sleep with great determination, the hat communicating with considerable eloquence that the two people on the other side of the fire should continue talking, and he was entirely absent from this conversation. They reached Cheyenne on the 6th day. It was a bigger town than Clara had expected, wide and loud and sprawling across the high plains, with the confident disorder of a place that had grown faster than its planning buildings going up on both sides of the main street, in various states of completion, freight wagons churning the mud of the thoroughfare into ruts that had frozen and thawed and refrozen until the road had the texture of bad intentions. Cole had been here before. He moved through it with the purposeful directness of a man who knows where he is going and does not require the place to impress him, and Clara and Wyatt followed in his wake through the noise and the cold. The federal courthouse was a brick building 2 blocks off the main street, modest and solid, with an American flag on a pole above the entrance that snapped and cracked in the Wyoming wind. Clara had looked at that flag from across the street for a long moment before they went in. She had a complicated relationship with flags just now. But she went in. The federal judge was a man named Hargrove Weld. He was 60, small and dry and precise, with the eyes of someone who had spent decades evaluating the credibility of what people told him and had developed as a result a gaze that could locate the fault lines in an argument the way a geologist finds rock fractures, not by looking for them specifically, but by looking at everything and letting them reveal themselves. He looked at Clara that way. She looked back. She had thought about this moment many times over the 6 days on the road, had rehearsed it, revised it, worried at it the way you worry at a loose thread that might unravel something important. She had been afraid in the quiet of various campsites that when she arrived in front of someone with the authority to actually listen, she would find that what she had was not enough, that it would sound like the desperate story of a frightened woman and not like the truth. But she sat in the chair across from Judge Hargrove Weld, and she told him what she had seen, and her voice did not shake. She told it in order, which was the way she had always thought, most clearly, chronologically, with the specific details she had fixed in her memory on that cold night in Dutton's ranch yard, because she had understood even then that details were the difference between testimony and complaint. The lantern light, the farmer's name Howard Pell, which she had not known then, but had since learned from Cole's folder, the position of the 3 men, the motion of Silas Dutton's hand, the small, casual, inexorable motion, the single shot. She told it all the way through to the rope at Kearney and the sew in Cole's door in the 6 weeks in the flight west. Judge Weld listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the documents in front of him. Cole's folder disassembled and laid out in the careful order Cole had arranged them the night before, cross-referenced with dates and names in the margin in that precise, spare handwriting. He looked at the contract. He looked at the clause Clara had put her finger on. He picked up the contract and read the clause again. Then he looked at Cole. You were a deputy in Kearney for 4 years, he said. Yes, Your Honor. And these records represent 2 years of documentation. Cole sat very still in the way he always sat, not rigid but grounded, as though his center of gravity were lower than other people's. Names, dates, property records, witness statements, where I could obtain them. 4 men, I believe, were killed on Dutton's order for land he wanted or information he needed controlled. He paused. Clara Weston saw him give that order in person. That is something I was never able to document. Weld looked at Clara again. You understand, he said, that your testimony will be used in a criminal proceeding, that you will be required to appear again before a court at that time. I understand, Clara said, and you are willing to do that? Yes, Clara said. She thought about Howard Pell's face in the lantern light, the hat turning in both hands, the absolute terror that had become grief. A man with a daughter. Yes, I am. Weld set the contract down. I will issue the warrant today, he said. It will be transmitted to every federal marshal in the territory by telegraph this afternoon. He folded his hands on the desk. Mr. Dutton will find his reach considerably shortened by morning. They were outside on the courthouse steps when Cole stopped walking. Clara, a step below him, turned back. He was standing on the top step with the Wyoming wind moving his coat, and he was looking at the sky in the way he looked at the sky when he was thinking rather than reading, and his face had the expression he wore after a thing was resolved, not triumphant because Cole Ramsey did not do triumph, but settled, complete. Wyatt came to stand beside his brother. They stood like that for a moment, the two of them, and Clara understood that this was a moment between them that went beyond the courthouse and the warrant and Silas Dutton, that this was the end of something that had begun 2 years ago when Cole had put his badge in Gideon Voss's desk and walked out of the Kearney Marshal's office and gone home to his ranch and opened a drawer and started a folder. 2 years of being careful and patient and certain that it would matter someday. It had mattered today. Wyatt put his hand on his brother's shoulder. Cole looked at him. No words. They did not need them. Then Wyatt looked at Clara and grinned the full, unguarded grin that she had first seen on the second morning at the ranch when he had assessed her biscuits with heroic diplomacy, and he said, California. They stayed 2 nights in Cheyenne. On the morning of the second day, as Cole was settling the account with the boarding house where they had taken rooms, the proprietor mentioned that he had been handed something by the telegraph office the previous afternoon, a message forwarded through from Kearney addressed to Cole Ramsey. It was from Gideon Voss. It was 4 words, done. He is held. Cole read it and put it in his coat pocket and went to settle the account. He did not say anything about it until they were an hour outside Cheyenne riding south and west on the road that would eventually become the long road to California. Then he took the paper from his pocket and passed it to Clara without explanation. She read it. She read it again. She passed it to Wyatt. Wyatt read it, folded it carefully, and passed it back to Cole. Voss, he said. Voss, Cole confirmed. There was a long quiet between them. He's going to have a hard time of it, Wyatt said. After this. He knew that. Cole looked at the road ahead. He did it anyway. Clara thought about Marshal Gideon Voss on his bay gelding, sitting outside the Ramsey Ranch fence line with the warrant in his hand, and Silas Dutton beside him, looking at the document and finding in its date the one procedural technicality that would hold. The fear in his posture and the resolution underneath it. The second it had taken him to decide. A man doing the right thing after a long time of not doing it. She thought it was possibly the most courageous thing she had seen, and she had seen several courageous things lately. The weeks that followed had the quality of a country she had not known existed. She had been many things in her 22 years. An orphan, a boarder, a woman who kept careful accounts and made careful choices and still found herself on the wrong end of everything that careful living was supposed to prevent. She had been for a few terrible weeks a condemned woman, and then a runaway, and then a fugitive, and then a woman building herself carefully out of borrowed materials in a borrowed name. She had not been free. Free was this. Free was the open road in the morning with the light coming sideways across the snow and making everything gold and specific. Free was learning in the second week how to make campfire coffee without burning it. The key, Cole told her, was the temperature of the water before you added the grounds, not after, and feeling the deep satisfaction of a small skill genuinely acquired. Free was Wyatt inventing constellations in the night sky above their campsite, with the creative confidence of a man who felt that the historical record on celestial naming had been overly conservative. The great coffee pot, he said, pointing. That's Ursa Major, Clara said. The bear is boring. Look at that shape. That is clearly a coffee pot. Wyatt? And that one, he moved his finger southeast. The heavenly biscuit. She looked at him. In honor of your early work, he said gravely. She threw a pine cone at him. Cole, sitting on the far side of the fire, made no comment. But Clara saw his shoulders move in a way that suggested the comment, while not made, was present. On the 14th night, somewhere in the high desert of the Utah Territory, they found the hot spring. It was Wyatt who found it following the sound of water when he had gone to look after the horses, and he came back to camp with an expression on his face that Clara by now could read without effort. The expression that meant he was about to say something that would seem outrageous until it turned out to be a good idea. There is a hot spring 20 yards north, he said, and I think we've all earned it. The water was extraordinary. Not hot enough to burn, not tepid enough to fail to matter, exactly the right temperature, rising from somewhere deep in the earth. and filling a natural basin among the rocks with a steady, patient warmth that made the cold air above the surface irrelevant. Clara sat in it up to her shoulders and looked at the stars above the Utah desert and felt weeks of trail dust and cold and tension leave her body in a way that was almost audible. She had not been fully warm since Kearney. She thought I had been cold for a long time, longer than Nebraska, longer than the cell, a cold that was about more than temperature, the cold of a life lived in places that were not hers, in arrangements that were other people's arrangements, moving through the world in the careful, minimizing way of someone who has learned not to take up too much space. She took up space now. She stretched her arms out in the warm water and took up space, and it felt like something she had been waiting to do for 22 years. Cole sat a few feet away, his back against the smooth rock at the edge of the basin, his eyes on the horizon as they usually were. Wyatt was on her other side, his shoulder healing cleanly now, his usual ease restored. "Tell me something I don't know," Wyatt said to the Skistumine. It was something he said sometimes in the evenings, the opening of a kind of conversation that had become a ritual of the road. "You first," Clara said. Wyatt thought about it. "When I was 19, I won a horse in a card game and was so guilty about it that I gave it back and lost $20 besides." A pause. "The man I won it from had cheated, so I cannot entirely explain my reasoning." "Conscience is not always logical," Clara said. "Cole's turn," Wyatt said. Cole was quiet for a moment. "My father wanted me to be a lawyer," he said. "I started reading for the law at 17. Stopped when he died." He looked at the water. "Sometimes I wonder what that would have been." "You use it anyway," Clara said. "What you learned." He looked at her. "In Cheyenne," she said, "everything you laid in front of that judge, the way you organized it, the way you understood what well needed to be persuaded." She paused. "That was the law. You just learned it differently than a classroom." He was quiet for a long time. "Your turn," Wyatt said to Clara. She looked at the stars. "I was terrified the whole time," she said. "Every day in that ranch house, every conversation with Voss, every moment on the road." She paused. "I was afraid the whole time, and I kept going anyway, and I think that's the bravest I've ever been." She looked at both of them. "I needed you both to know that it wasn't courage. It was just refusing to stop." Wyatt looked at her with his open, generous face. "Clara," he said softly, "that's exactly what courage is." On the 17th day in the high basin country between Utah and Nevada, they picked up a tail. Clara noticed it first, not the riders themselves who were too distant and too careful to be seen clearly, but the quality of their absence. Two shapes on a ridgeline that disappeared when she looked directly at them. The same two shapes appearing at a different ridgeline an hour later, maintaining the same distance with the precision of men who had done this before. She said nothing for the better part of an hour. She turned it over in her mind the way Cole had taught her to turn observations over, look at it from multiple angles before you commit to what it is. Then she let her horse fall back to ride beside Cole. "We have company," she said without turning her head. "Two of them, ridge lines. They've been holding distance for at least an hour." Cole did not look at the ridges. "Northeast and southwest," he said. "Northeast first, then southwest." He was quiet for a full stride. "I know," he said, "since this morning." He turned slightly. "They're not Silas's men. They'd have moved by now if they meant to take us. Opportunists, most likely. Watching to see if we're worth the trouble. What do? We show them we aren't worth the trouble." He altered their course by perhaps 20 degrees, angling toward a long, rocky upthrust ahead that would require negotiation and provided its own natural defense. "We look like we know exactly where we're going, and we're entirely untroubled by them." "Do we know exactly where we're going?" The almost smile. "Near enough." For 2 full days, the distant shapes maintained their presence on the ridgelines. And for 2 full days, Cole led them through terrain that made the calculation of ambush progressively less favorable. Rocky ground defensible camping positions, routes that provided clear sight lines in all directions. On the morning of the 3rd day, the shapes were gone. Wyatt, who had been watching this unfold with the studious nonchalance of a man pretending he was not watching it, said only "gone." "Gone," Cole confirmed. Wyatt looked at Clara. Clara looked at Wyatt. Something passed between them that did not require words or recognition that the man riding ahead of them had managed all of this without alarm, without drama, without a single unnecessary expenditure of anyone's fear. Just knowledge applied to problem. Just the land read correctly. He's something, isn't he? Wyatt said quietly. Yes, Clara said. He is. The post station on the 28th day was a low adobe building at a trail crossing in the Nevada Territory run by a leathery man named Horace who appeared to do all functions simultaneously: postmaster, stable hand, short order cook, with the unhurried competence of someone who had been doing all three for long enough that they no longer seemed like separate tasks. Cole gave Horace the letter for Amos. He had written it 2 nights before at camp, precise and practical, the full accounting of what had happened and what came next, with instructions for the ranch and the cattle and the legal documents that would need filing. Horace took the letter, glanced at the address, and then reached under the counter and produced a flat wooden box, the kind post stations used for items awaiting collection, and set it on the counter. Ramsey, you said? He looked at Cole. Been sitting here a good while, this one. Ryder came through from Kearney last fall, quiet man, said his name was Briggs, dropped it off, said it had been sitting unclaimed at the depot and he didn't know what else to do with it. Horace rummaged in the box and produced an envelope. The paper had gone slightly soft at the corners with age. Address on it is Philadelphia, but it came back undeliverable. Looks like whoever it was meant for had already left before it arrived. Clara looked at the envelope. The handwriting on the front was angular and spare, and she knew it because she had been watching it make notations in margins and record names in columns for weeks. She knew it the way you know a voice not by analysis, but by something more immediate than analysis. She looked up at Cole. His expression had gone very still in a way she had not seen before, not the controlled stillness of a man choosing how to respond, but the genuine stillness of a man who has been surprised by something he thought was gone. He said nothing. She opened the envelope. The paper inside was a single page, and it was dated 8 months before Clara had stepped off any train in Nebraska, and it began Miss Weston. She read it slowly because the words deserved that, and because she was aware somewhere beneath the reading that this was the kind of thing that only happens in stories that turn out to be true. Cole Ramsey had read her advertisement in the spring. He had read it, and he had sat at the oak desk in the corner of his ranch house in Kearney, and he had written back, and the letter had crossed its long distance to Philadelphia and arrived to an empty room because Clara had already taken the stage to the rail station with her leather trunk and her reticule and her $12 and her careful plans. He had sent the letter to a woman who had already left to marry someone else. And then he had assumed she had chosen differently, and he had gone back to his ranch and his folder and his patient waiting, and the letter had made its way west with a quiet man named Amos, who did not know what it contained but understood that unclaimed things deserved to find their owners. I am not a man who writes letters, well, he had written. I will try to be plain. I have a working cattle operation and a brother who talks too much and enough land to be useful if a person wanted to use it. I cannot promise things I do not know to be certain. I can promise that you would have a house that is yours and that I would not make you afraid in it. I read your advertisement 3 times. Most of them read like business proposals. Yours read like the truth. I think a person who writes the truth in such a small space might be someone worth meeting. If you are willing, write back. Cole Ramsey. Clara stood at the counter of the post station in the Nevada Territory and finished reading and looked up. Wyatt was looking at the ceiling in the elaborate posture of someone deeply interested in the architectural details of adobe construction. Cole was watching her. She crossed the distance between them, the 3 steps across the post station's worn floorboards, and held the letter out to him, and he took it from her, and she did not let go of it, so for a moment they were both holding it. You should have written again when the first one came back, she said. I didn't know it came back, he said. I thought you had chosen someone else. I chose someone else, she said. It was a mistake. He looked at her over the letter for a long moment. I would like to send this now, he said quietly, if you'll receive it. I've already read it, she said. I know. A pause, the almost smile. I'm asking anyway. She let go of the letter. Yes, she said. I'll receive it. Wyatt developed an intense interest in a map on the wall and began pointing out geographical features to Horace, who bore this with the patience of a man who had seen stranger things at trail crossings and had learned to accommodate them. They saw the Pacific Ocean for the first time on a Tuesday morning in late February. They had crested a long ridge through the coastal hills, and the land had simply opened, dropped away, the grass and timber falling toward Something that was not land, that was not sky, that was a third thing entirely immense and flat and moving in a color that Clara had no word for because she had never seen it before. Blue was wrong. Green was wrong. It was something between and beyond both of those, stretching from the base of the cliffs below them to the edge of the world. None of them spoke. They sat their horses on the ridge and looked at it for a long time. Mendocino was built on the headlands above the ocean, a small town of wooden buildings set at the edge of the continent, with the calm of a place that has accepted its own remoteness and found it comfortable. The timber industry drove it as coal had known it would, and timber needed men who could organize and lead, which meant there was work for him before a week was out. The town did not ask many questions. Clara appreciated this more than she could say. She found a room at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Aldrich, a spare, sensible woman from Vermont who provided excellent breakfast and maintained a policy of considered non-interest in her boarders' histories that Clara recognized as a form of deliberate kindness. Cole and Wyatt took rooms at the other end of town near the mill. They had dinner together every evening at a table at the back of the only decent restaurant Mendocino offered, and the arrangement was noticed by the town in the way small towns notice things fully and without comment, the commentary reserved for private conversations in other rooms. Wyatt started his freight business in the second week. He had 2 customers by the end of it. Clara started her garden in the third week. The soil here was something she had not expected, coastal and rocky and rich with the fertility of land that has been deposited slowly, carefully over a very long time. She turned it with a borrowed spade on a cold March morning, working along the south-facing wall of the boarding house, and Mrs. Aldrich came out and looked at what she was doing and went back inside and returned with a handful of seed packets that she pressed into Clara's hands without ceremony. "They need more sun than they'll get here," Mrs. Aldrich said, "but they'll grow anyway. Things do if you give them room." Clara planted them in straight rows. She thought about what room looked like. She had been thinking about this in various forms since the hollow between the hills in Nebraska, since the hot spring in Utah, since the post station in Nevada. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket, soft at the corners, now from handling, and the man who had written it and waited and assumed the wrong thing and gone on waiting in the patient way of someone who has accepted a loss without losing the habit of hoping. She thought about what her life would look like if she let it be what it was trying to be. They found the land in April. It was on the south edge of town, a 12-acre parcel running down from the road to a natural break where the forest began with a creek on the west side and a view across the open headlands to the ocean. A previous owner had cleared the front 4 acres and built a foundation before apparently abandoning the project, which meant the hard groundwork was done and what remained was the building. Cole bought it on a Thursday. He told Clara and Wyatt on Thursday evening at dinner, setting the deed on the table between their plates with the matter-of-fact manner of a man reporting a completed task. Wyatt looked at the deed. He looked at his brother. He said, "We're going to need more hands." "Probably," Cole said. "The mill owner has 2 sons who are apparently looking for outside work." "I know. And there's a man named—" "I know Wyatt." Wyatt sat back and crossed his arms and smiled, the slow smile of a man watching something come true that he has been certain of for a long time. He looked at Clara. She looked at the deed. Then she looked out the restaurant window at the street, which was catching the last of the evening light and throwing it back gold against the storefronts. She felt something release. Not dramatically, not the way releases happen in stories with a qualp and the sudden articulation of something long, suppressed, quietly, incrementally. The way winter ends in a place like this, not all at once, but in small daily concessions each morning, slightly less cold than the last, until one day you are simply somewhere different than you were. She was somewhere different than she had ever been. They built the house through spring and into summer. Cole drew the plans. Wyatt framed it with the energy of a man who has been patient about something for a long time and is ready now to be finished with patience. Clara designed the interior. She had ideas she had not known she had about space and light, and the way a kitchen should work for 3 people who were all accustomed to cooking, or trying to, and who had learned over the course of a Nebraska winter and the long road west that their best work happened when they were in the same room. The bedroom was large. The kitchen was larger. There was a garden on the south side already planted, already growing. On the last day of June, they moved in. They had no furniture yet except the beds Cole had ordered from a craftsman in San Francisco and the kitchen table they had bought in town, and the rooms were bare and smelled of new lumber and the clean smell of the ocean that came through the windows they had built to face it. They carried their things in and set them down and stood in the front room and looked at what they had made. "We did it," Wyatt said. His voice had a quality in it that Claire had not heard before, a quietness underneath the usual warmth, the sound of a man moved beyond his own volume. Neither of the others said anything. They stood in their house, the three of them, in the long summer evening light, with the ocean visible through the open window and the garden just beginning to show green through the south glass. And there was no particular reason for what happened next, except that it was the right moment and they all felt it. Wyatt went first. He crossed the room and put his arms around Clara, from behind his chin on the top of her head, and she felt the laugh that he swallowed because the moment was too serious for laughing, though only just. Then Cole, who crossed the room without hurry, put one hand on his brother's shoulder and the other hand on Clara's face, tilting it up, and the kiss he pressed to her forehead was slow and deliberate and meant. They stood like that for a long time. The light moved across the floor. Eventually, Wyatt said, his voice muffled against her hair, "We should probably get the rest of the boxes." "Probably," Cole said. Nobody moved for another minute. 1 year later, on a Tuesday afternoon in July, a letter arrived. Clara found it on the kitchen table when she came in from the garden, with her hands full of dirt and her hair coming down from its pins. And she looked at the return address, Kearney, Nebraska, and felt the old reflex of the old fear, before she recognized that the handwriting was not Dutton's, because Dutton's handwriting was not writing anything anymore. She opened the letter. It was from Gideon Voss. He wrote plainly in the manner of a man who has thought for a long time about what to say and arrived at the minimum. He said that Silas Dutton had died in the Territorial Holding Facility in April of what the prison doctor recorded as cardiac failure, and what Voss suspected was simply a man who could not survive the removal of his own power. He said that the land claims of Howard Pell's family had been restored along with several others. Howard Pell's daughter was 15 now, old enough to understand what had been returned to her. He said that he had submitted his resignation as marshal effective at the end of the month. He said he was going west. He said, "I have been thinking about what a man owes the people he failed to protect when protection was his job. I don't know that it can be fully paid, but I think I know how to start." Then there was a space on the page, a visible pause, the kind that comes when a man has said what he needs to say and is deciding whether to say one more thing. He said, "One more thing, Miss Weston. I found these in my cousin's papers when we cleared his office. They belong to you." Inside the envelope behind the letter were two things. The first was the original mail-order bride advertisement from the Philadelphia Inquirer, the small 4-line advertisement she had written at the desk in her room on Chestnut Street, the one she had almost rewritten to sound less honest, the one she had sent anyway. The second was a letter in angular spare handwriting, dated 8 months before any of this had begun. She looked at it for a long moment before she understood what she was holding. She already had Cole's letter, the copy that Amos had forwarded west, that had found her at the Nevada Post Station. She had read that copy so many times the paper was soft as worn linen. But this copy was different. This was the original, the one Cole's hand had touched when he sealed it, the one that had traveled from Kearney to Philadelphia and come back undeliverable. The one that had passed through the Kearney post office where a clerk had made the standard duplicate for the forwarding file before the original was collected by Silas Dutton himself, who had intercepted it and kept it in his desk, because a letter from Cole Ramsey to a mail-order bride was exactly the kind of information a man like Silas Dutton held close for future use. Cole had written to her. Silas had known it. And still the duplicate had found her because Amos Briggs was the most economical man in Nebraska and had spent 30 years believing that unclaimed things deserved to find their owners. Clara held both copies, the worn duplicate and the crisp original, and looked at them for a long time. Then she walked out the back door to the garden, where the sun was still high and the ocean beyond the headlands was doing the thing it always did in the afternoon, going very blue, very still, the light making it look like something you could walk out onto if you were brave enough. Cole was at the far end of the garden, checking the irrigation on the bean rows, crouched on his heels, with his hat pushed back and his face turned down to the work. He looked up when she came out. She crossed the garden and held out the letter, the original, the first one, the one that had been lost so long it had become more story than paper. He stood. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Voss," she said. He nodded slowly. He took the letter from her hands and looked at it for a moment, and she saw him recognize it, saw the recognition move through his face with the same quality as the evening in the Nevada post station, that genuine surprise of a man finding something he had given up. Silas had it, Clara said. He took it from the post office before it could be forwarded. He knew you'd written to me. She paused. He knew, and he let me come anyway, because a woman with nowhere else to go and no one who'd written to her was easier to control than a woman who had options. Cole looked at the letter in his hand. Something moved through his expression, not anger exactly, because anger required energy he had long since spent more usefully, but a cold, final accounting. The kind of look a man gets when the last piece of something falls into place and the picture it makes is exactly as ugly as he suspected. It got there eventually, Clara said. He looked up from the paper. She held his gaze. Behind them, from somewhere inside the house, she could hear Wyatt moving around in the kitchen, the sound of him talking to himself, which he did when he was cooking a running commentary addressed to no one that somehow made everything more inhabited. It did, Cole said. He folded the letter. He did not put it in his pocket. He held it in his hand and he looked at her, and the look was the same look she had first cataloged on the 6th day at the ranch, the look of a man seeing something clearly and deciding what to do about it, except that the decision had already been made a long time ago, and what remained now was only the ongoing choosing of it day after day, in the way that the only choices worth making are always made. She put her hand over his, over the hand that held the letter, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they stood in the garden in the summer afternoon light, with the ocean beyond the headlands and the house behind them full of the sound of Wyatt Ramsay narrating his own cooking. She thought about the rope around her neck in the Kearney town square. She thought about the rope slipping free. She thought about the snow and the running and the door and the fur and all the long road that had led to this garden, this ground, this hand holding hers. She thought about Howard Pell's daughter, who was 15 now and had her father's land back. She thought about Gideon Voss riding west to start paying a debt he had decided could not remain unpaid. She thought about Amos Briggs and a letter he had carried west because he believed unclaimed things deserved to find their owners. She thought about all the small acts of decency that had accumulated quietly and without announcement to bring her here. She thought about how none of it would have brought her here if she had not been brave enough when the moment came to run toward the unknown rather than simply away from the known. If she had not taken a letter seriously, if she had not refused to stop, if she had not, on a cold morning in a Nebraska ranch house, laughed at a failed biscuit and let the laugh be real. She looked at Cole. He looked at her. She thought, this is what it feels like when something is yours. Not given, not contracted, not arranged in advance by someone else's hand. Chosen. Chosen every morning when the light came through the east windows they had built to face the sunrise. Chosen every evening when the three of them sat at the kitchen table and the ocean went gold outside. Chosen in the small daily intimacies of people who have decided that the building of a life together is the most serious and most worthwhile work they know how to do. She squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. Inside the house, Wyatt announced to no one in particular that the biscuits were ready and that he needed everyone to understand this actually good this time, and that the historical record of biscuit outcomes in this household needed to be reassessed in light of new evidence. Clara laughed. Cole said under his breath, with the dry precision of a man who chooses his words for accuracy above all else, "They'll be fine." And they were. And so was everything else.